This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. This show deals with living the Catholic faith in our time, discovering God's presence in our lives, and finding hope in His Word. And now, your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Monsignor Don Wolf, rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. If you pay any attention to the Catholic press, you know this summer has been a time in which a great deal of focus has been directed to conversations about schism and Latin and liturgy and governance. Well, I don't know if conversation is exactly the right word to use. As I read articles and see what get posted on social media, it's not quite right to say people are doing a lot of conversing. Mostly it seems they state their position, presume it to be self-explanatory as well as unassailable, and then just go on. Maybe that's simply the new normal, but it hasn't made for a lot of back and forth when it comes to the life of the Church, the Second Vatican Council, liturgical celebrations, and the integrity of the Church. But it certainly has made for a lot of passion poured out into the ether and onto our screens. A lot of what's said seems odd to me, especially because now I occupy a somewhat rarefied position. By that I mean I'm old enough to have heard these kinds of things before, as well as being just old enough to remember how things were before the changes so many now comment on took place. I admit I was just a kid, and no one was filling us with great theological rationale for what we were experiencing or what we were a part of while we were doing it. And I'm the first to say that, like all of the people I knew, I went along with what happened without the slightest thought anything could be or should be different. Then again, as a kid, that was my point of view about everything, from hit programs on TV to the top policies of the government. Things were just as they were. I wasn't part of making anything different at all. And I bring those items up because when you're immersed in your culture and environment, the last thing you can do is have some perspective on what's going on. It's like trying to appreciate a painting from the perspective of the paint on the canvas. If you're there on the canvas, all you'd be aware of is the paint that borders you and the brushstrokes next to yours. You'd have no real idea what the canvas truly conveyed, no idea what the real picture was. Only if you're able to step out of the painting and find a perspective distant from it could you begin to see truly what the canvas contained. And that would simply be the first step in understanding and critiquing what was there. After all, the experience from the paint's location couldn't tell you if it were a felt painting of Elvis singing in his jumpsuit or an artistic interpretation of Evening Twilight at Rouen Cathedral. Whatever it might be, it'd be subject to the additional interpretation of all that had come before it, all the conversation about it, and all that would come after it. Just being there wouldn't give you a good sense of what was going on. For example, when I was growing up in my tender years in the late 50s and early 60s, the number one TV program each week began with a man shooting another man dead in the street. That same heroic character who had done the killing, his best friend in town was a prostitute at the combination gambling hall, bar, and brothel on Main Street. Not one of us watching seemed to be bothered by or even aware of the curious combination of identities, moralities, and histories that were on view there. It was simply what was on TV when we watched and enjoyed all of the drama of Gunsmoke. In the same way, just having been there when the conversations were going on about the topics of the day presents no presumption of gigantic insight, either about the issues or about what was really happening as those issues were addressed and sorted out. Mere presence isn't a very powerful claim to understanding or to advocacy. But I was there. I did experience a lot of the changes that seem to occupy the concerns of a lot of people who've become very vocal these days. And I do bring all to the recall of my experience the one thing missing in all of the accounts that I've seen so far, which is the understanding of what it was like being in the middle of those changes and what it felt like. Again, I was just a kid. I don't speak for the adults I knew who didn't say much of anything to me about their feelings or their conclusions in the middle of things. But as a kid, I did have the experience of moving from one way of doing things to other ways of doing things. And I noticed the changes, and they mattered to me. They weren't neutral, nor were they without their impact or effect. So I thought I'd describe some of the changes I did experience at the time. Some of them were merely occasional. Others had a more deliberate and a more substantial impact on me. And I'll begin with the fact that in the course of those years, there were conversations about what was happening and what was proposed. I remember one morning, as we were preparing to take our tractors out to the field for a day of plowing, my uncle was talking about the sermon in his parish that was about distributing communion. The import of what he said was that it'd be different than it had been before. Now, it's not nearly as important what the change was as to note that it was the topic of conversation as we were greasing our rolling coulters and checking the oil in our engines. And no one thought it was weird that we'd be talking about communion in church on Sunday as we were going about our daily chores during the week. For me, at the time, these things were all part of the same whole. What went on in one sphere affected what went on in the other, at least up to the level of conversation. Again, I don't want to give the impression that we paused and talked about Eucharistic presence or the dogmatic constitution of the church as we slopped the hogs. We were talking about the day-to-day concerns about the life and practice of going to Mass, which we all did and which mattered to us. This question had as much to do about when we were supposed to stand up and come down the aisle as it had to do with anything else with regarding the faith or belief or our stance about things. But it was a topic of conversation, and none of us were nonplussed or put off by it. We were talking about the day-to-day concern about the practice of Sunday Mass, which made a big difference to us. In addition, we all had opinions about it. The questions and concerns about receiving communion differently wasn't simply a matter of Father said. It was what concerned us. We all had opinions about the sense of it. It was a précis of how we lived and acted at that time. What was going on in church mattered to us because in every way, the church mattered to us. Plus, I have to also note that I belong to the parish of Immaculate Conception in Oklahoma City. That's important because Immaculate Conception was built as a grade school, and the chapel we went to Mass in was the auditorium. I was not part of some gigantic, noble parish church filled with marble and finery, a cathedral of beauty and art and nobility. Everything about where I went to Mass was temporary and spare, from the tile on the floor to the acoustic ceiling above us. When the parish was first founded, the pastor and the associate in the parish lived in the parish building, the pastor in what was to become the principal's office, and the associate in the mechanical room with his bed next to the furnace. It was not a place given to the great things of life or invested in the greatness of the church. When the changes began happening as a result of the council, there was nothing much diminished in our little church. I note this because so much of the critique of the alteration in parish life and practice comes with the notion that the everyday splendor of church life became something drab. Bishop Robert Barron, who's about 5 years younger than I, used to say that he thought the church at his time was bland, that it lacked the spiciness it had had in a previous age. We became embarrassed at the piquant flavor of our regular diet and then opted for what was flat and plain. But that was not the case in my life. There was no change that took anything away from what was the regular diet of religious life and the boxy auditorium that masqueraded as the church in which I was baptized, where I received First Communion, where I was confirmed, and where I celebrated my first Mass. The first and most immediate experience of the changes coming along following the Vatican Council that I experienced was when it came time for me to become an altar boy. This was a rite of passage most kids in my age group had. It was especially germane to me and my brother because we were two of the very few kids who were present at the 7 a.m. Mass at the parish on Sunday morning. If we didn't step up to be part of the altar server team, there likely wouldn't have been anybody else. So when our time came around, it fell to us to get ready. And getting ready was much facilitated that year by having the altar boy parts go from Latin to English. We were required to memorize the prayers, as every generation of servers had done for nearly 500 years, but the prayers were in English, not in Latin. This, of course, meant we still had to sit down with our mother and go through all of the things to say and be confident enough to say them that they'd come to mind without a thought of anxiety or fear, as you were required to say them to God and to Father McCarthy and in front of all of the people who had known you since you were born. You had to imprint them on your memory with as much force, and sometimes it felt with as much pain as if you were branding the mark onto your skin. It seems odd to say this now because the prayers we were required to memorize are the same ones we all know now by heart and can repeat any moment the rhythm of those prayers is engaged. The heart of what we had to say at the foot of the altar was the Confiteor, the "I confess to Almighty God and to you, my brothers and sisters, that I have greatly sinned." At the time, this was done exactly as it had been done in Latin, except it was then in English. We processed out of the sacristy to the front of the church. The priest knelt at the foot of the altar, and we altar servers were the community who repeated the prayers of the people. It was just between the priest and us, though, no one else. Everyone else stood silently in the pews. Having all this in English put a sharper point on it than had it remained in Latin. That is, even the casual listener would know that if you made a mistake or somehow had substituted or mispronounced one word for another when it was English, they'd know you'd done it. Do it in Latin, and only another altar boy or the priest or your mother would know you flubbed what you were supposed to say. But then again, even in English, the interchange was between the priest, God, and you. The rest of the folks were there, isolated by what was going on apart from them. So it mattered that you get everything right. And like all altar boys, the first couple of times you imagine the whole church is looking at you, and then at everything you do, and listening to you above all else. Then when you finally calm down and realize a little something about what's really happening, it's easy to fall into the next temptation, which is to presume that you're invisible. That is, you presume nothing you do matters all that much, since no one is really paying attention to you. These extremes are as present now as they were when I first stepped onto the altar with Father McCarthy all those years ago. It's a perennial part of being in front. I don't think the changes in language affected the polarities that much, although the de-emphasis of the private dialogue between priest and altar boys, returning it to the whole body of people gathered for Mass, de-emphasized having everyone pay attention to what the altar boys were saying, which then lessened the polarities a bit. When I first became an altar server, one of the things I heard from my family, especially my uncles and my grandmother, was that as an altar server, I would be closer than anyone else to the altar and what was happening. To be close, that was the blessing and the attraction to the commitment to serve at Mass. It made sense, even to us 9-year-olds, that we were right there. When Mass had been in Latin, proximity was something important, and its importance was communicated to those in the previous generation. I don't remember ever hearing this inducement from the priests training us to serve Mass. They never mentioned it. Of course, physical proximity isn't an especial premium when it comes to the blessings of the sacrament, but in the peasant spirituality that swirled around my family, it mattered. And my brother and me certainly took some pride in knowing we were entering into this special inducement to be a part of something important. Even before I'd gotten to the age of becoming an altar server, I'd been intrigued with what was going on at the altar. This intrigue was encouraged by my parents. I asked, and they agreed that at Sunday Mass, my brother and I and my cousin would sit on the front row to be closest to what was going on. This may have had as much to do with the fact that I was extremely nearsighted and couldn't see much of anything past about 10 feet, a condition that wasn't remedied until I was in the 7th grade. So getting closer was important in sustaining my interest and deepening my sense of understanding and participation. It didn't seem all that different or unusual at the time, but I guess I was always interested in being more present to and more woven into the experience of what was going on Sunday. The changes happening around this time facilitated my interest quite a lot. And that it was something out of the ordinary that my brother and my cousin Bobby and I could share also made it special. Much later on, when I went to college, this sense of proximity played an important part in my growing awareness of spiritual meaning and purpose. Unlike a lot of my classmates and my brother, I continued to serve Mass all through high school. On my first Sunday at OSU, there was no one to serve at the 7:30 Mass in the morning, so I volunteered. I wasn't thinking in terms of intimacy with Christ, only that I wanted to be helpful, and I knew how to. That first Sunday led to developing a relationship with a pastor that eventually led to a more profound exploration of my vocation. It turned out that proximity did mean a lot, and a lot more than I had first imagined. Not only that, but the pastor at OSU tried to make the Eucharistic experience much more intimate than we had previously experienced. To this end, he'd have us come and sit around the altar when we had student masses late on Wednesday nights, presuming that we'd be enlivened by our closer sense of participative engagement. Eventually, he set up a portable altar in the parish hall and had us come and sit around the altar with one another as we gathered there, both to engage us with each other as well as to bring us closer to the center of our celebration so that we would all be proximate to the Eucharistic action going on there. Now, whether the metaphor of participation by physical closeness is apt or not, it certainly worked for me. I never felt more engaged or more involved or more moved by the Eucharist as I did when he made the special effort to bring us closer, to occupy us more directly in our prayers together. For me, at that time, it was how he developed my active participation. One of the other elements of change going on at the time was the wider invitation to take part in the various services happening in the parish. Because my brother and I were Mass servers, we were also invited to be lectors as well. This was especially the case because at our parish, we went to the earliest Mass on Sunday morning, and there were very few people willing to accept the role of lector. That level of participation was something new, and there were more than a few people who stayed away from its demands. So the pastor turned to his altar boys to do the readings. I enjoyed it both because I always liked to read, as well as because I never suffered from stage fright. I liked being up and being an important part of what was going on. My brother, it wasn't quite the same. One Sunday, he was tasked at the very last moment, to read the story of Pentecost from the Acts of the Apostles. At first look, he had to wade through Parthians, Medes, Elamites from Mesopotamia, Judea, and Cappadocia, and on and on. By the time he'd stumbled to the finish line, I don't think he ever wanted to read in church again. But all detractive possibilities aside, it was a heady time in which we were offered a vastly more engaged way to be a part of the celebration of the liturgy. And when it was offered, I was glad to accept it. My brother and I were very active as altar servers. There was one really good cassock in the closet in the sanctuary. We both wore about the same size, so we both wanted to be the first to get there to the sacristy to be able to wear it. When we arrived at church before Mass, we'd walk quickly down the aisle to the front of the church, elbowing each other out of the way to be the first one to get there and pull it off the hanger. The other one of us was stuck wearing one of the lesser cassocks. As brothers, there wasn't anything we wouldn't fight about, which including what we were going to do on Sunday. The changes from Latin to English was, in my experience, a breakthrough moment. It happened only gradually in the parish. At first, the transition began with the minor prayers, like the ones at the foot of the altar at the beginning of Mass, then later on to the major parts of Mass, and then finally to include the Eucharistic prayer. I still remember the Sunday when everything we did that day was all in English. I found it to be an amazing thing that I understood. The amazing thing was that I understood everything that was said. It wasn't a kind of aha moment in which I said to myself, "Thank God it's all now this way." It would have been foolish to say that, especially since the liturgy in Latin was the only thing I had ever experienced before. It was more the slow realization that everything that was said did not include all those things I didn't understand. It was all for me that it was all for me. That's what I began to experience. I found it to be glorious. This was also a time in which music came to play, something to pay attention to. Going to Mass early on Sunday morning, there was almost never music at Mass. As the liturgy changed, there was an expectation that music would be present in some manner. So we had an organist to play the hymns. Mostly they were the ones that became a staple part of liturgy around the country. I wouldn't say I ever internalized the notion that music and singing was integral to the celebration of the Eucharist. It certainly was not a foundational element in my religious upbringing, but once the associate pastor invited one of the high school kids to come and play his trombone at Mass. This was wildly innovative and I guess was part of the spirit of the times. I learned only very much later that this instrument, the trombone, had been exclusively used as a church instrument in previous ages, and those who used it for secular entertainment were accused of sacrilege when it was played outside of the church choir. It was just the reverse in our experience. My father hated it and talked about how much he did for about 6 weeks after he heard it. Right now, I couldn't tell you whether it was to complement the organ or whether there was some kind of trombone solo or whatever. All I really remember was how much feeling my father put into rejecting it. And I guess he could afford to. It was about the only musical experiment I really remember during those times. As I said, music was not much of an issue for us, ever. More than anything, the life of the church was woven into the life of my family. My mother was very intent on making sure we were all active in the life of the parish as much as we could be. It was a profound sorrow to her when the school closed and we were taught by lay people on Wednesday nights, rather than by sisters in classrooms all day long. But those were the times as well. We went to all of the services of Holy Week, and we were present at the Easter Vigil and part of church life and everything. And while Immaculate Conception Parish was far down on the list of active parishes staffed by incisive and talented clerics, I never once heard anyone in the parish or in my family complain about what the pastor did or didn't do. Criticizing the parish, the pastor, or the church was simply beyond the range of practice in our religious lives. The adults may have done so in some venue more private, but all of us were from big families who lived life always within earshot. I never heard a negative word about the church from anyone. In the case of my father, it was the music he didn't like, as well as the chutzpah of the kids who played it. He didn't criticize the church for it. I know these are all little things. The great conversation about the enormous shift in points of view and common practice happened up and down the Catholic world at this time, and they made a gigantic difference to everybody. And as in all moments of great passion and enormous energy, things were said and done that could not be unsaid or undone, wounding the sensibilities and the comfort of all of the people. When the complaints are lodged and when whole movements are confronted, it's always the big issues that come to the fore. The passing moment and the little memories don't count for a lot. And yet, there is no true solid life that's not made up from the small pebbles of individual experiences and particular memories that we come to. Enmeshed in all of the great movements of ideas and commitments are the small moments we lived. What I found mostly missing in so much of what gets said and commented on in the various media is the moment of hope and the truth of life at the moment these great changes were among us. In the sum of my religious experience, I've been mostly content with the history that has unfolded around me. Were I king of the universe or angel of chronicles, I rewrite some of that history, both by changing what had happened, as well as changing what people thought about what happened. But I am neither king nor angel. I am a supplicant of meaning, hoping to find the deepest purpose in what I've been given by those who entrusted their decision and their actions to me. My vision is no wider and no deeper than those who shaped my world. As the moments come to shape the world according to my understanding, I do so humbled by the limitations of what I know and what I comprehend. I hope that the gifts I pass on in those changes will be worthy of the gifts I have received. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse, of a poem today called, Is It Possible? Is it possible, really, or profitable to plan, to conform the objects so as to fill our hands to the contingencies of tomorrow, said we need not worry so much, so we need not trust to luck as so many do to their sorrow? There are those places and those other races that are not so set. They allow the world to turn and fly through space, untouched by the exigencies of life and unpredictability, shake off all stability. They get to live beyond the calendar and past the hour, seem empowered compared to us and ours. Of course, they would starve if wrestling their living was hard and cold, and give its support only slow and spare. Making space to do and to care is the hope we hold to in some. So we can live too, even amid the world of doing and all of its ensuing problems. We can plan to get all we need done. Is it possible? I want everybody to know that it's possible to access the past programs if you go to Oklahoma Catholic Radio webpage and go to the programs there. And if you open up the box for the programs, they have an option for the archives or for the past programs. So you can go there for the programs for Living Catholic in the past. It's extend back for several years, so there's a good number of programs if you're interested in that. What we try to do is to bring the opportunity for what it means to be living Catholic into the various experiences that we have in the life of the church and in the life of the faith. Because, after all, living Catholic isn't simply a matter of opening up a catechism or turning to a particular page. It's engaging our life in the process of encountering Christ in the everyday. And that's what the focus of our ministry is, and it's certainly the focus of what Living Catholic is and wants to be. The opportunity to find in our experience of living the faith that the encounter with Christ is something that's living and exciting, something that's true and actual, and it's available to us simply by the process of what we experience continually, in fact, every day. So I hope in the weeks to come you can continue to join us here on our exploration of what it means to be living Catholic.
Living Catholic is a production of the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City for Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.